All right, let's pick back up here with this map. This is where we left off. And I can't really use the pointer, unfortunately, because this little thing will get in the way. So let's just talk through, without really getting into excruciating detail, why this slide is so important, right? If you're the kind of person who really likes visual learning, but also wants to make sure that you're learning in sequence, learning in chronological order, then this is a map that you should really get acquainted with. All right, so you can see, and in fact, the quiz that we had on Friday was using this map, if you recall, right? I just blanked out the word Palestine and got rid of the date. But in any event, let's take a look at some of the key details that are significant for each of these maps, but I would just recommend that you pause this while you're watching this video and really get acquainted with the details and potentially use them in your notes. Take screenshots if you want. So, the first map we see is all pre-Balfour Declaration. So you can see that this was the British Mandate of Palestine, right? Or Palestine under the Ottoman Empire. But ultimately, what's really interesting about this initial map is this shows the sort of the desired location for the Jewish people, right? You see that in the late 1800s, the World Zionist Organization is founded, right? And this is the first time that Herzl actually specifically indicates that Palestine is supposed to be the homeland for the Jewish people. When he was writing about it prior to that, he was not as explicit. And then, of course, you already know from the previous video about the Balfour Declaration. So after the Balfour Declaration, then we start to see a migration of Jewish people from throughout the diaspora into Palestine. And so just take a look at how these maps change. You might ask questions about this map versus this map. You might say, okay, I don't understand how 1 year has passed and the map looks like this. Well, realize that this is simply what lands were designated for Jewish settlement. This does not mean that in 1 year suddenly the population skyrocketed like that. But why we should care is notice the ways in which the borders are actually drawn, right? To a large extent, when the United Nations drew its partition, they were drawing around the pre-existing settlements. So they thought they were drawing a good map. But nonetheless, Jerusalem, which did have Jewish settlers, by the way, was right in the middle of Palestinian designated territories. And of course, in the years leading up to this partition, there were already terrorist attacks, such as the bombing of the King David Hotel. And so we, as outsiders, can look at this map and think about how problematic it would be in the future. But nonetheless, we also know, of course, the after effects. And with that said, I think that we get the idea of these maps. If you look at the last one, you should understand that this is also including the presence of settlements. Notice, if you can't see this, if your brightness isn't too high, this still indicates the green line. But yet we do see that there is a Jewish presence within the green line, which indicates the existence of settlements. All right, cool. So speaking of settlements, I think we have a pretty good grasp of these. But yet again, settlements are essentially these neighborhoods of Jewish settlers in Palestinian designated territories. Now, most of the settlements that we see are in the West Bank area. But there were some in Gaza prior to the evacuation in 2005, and there are still some in Golan Heights. But 2008, we see that there were approximately 200 Israeli settlers in the lands just immediately in and around Jerusalem, about 200,000 more in areas around the West Bank. And by today, I think we're looking at in or slightly over 500,000 Jewish settlers living somewhere in Palestinian designated territories, or previous Palestinian territories, I should say. We will, of course, get into more detail about the intifadas, but we can surmise that the intifadas were also a reaction against these increasing developments of settlements. And it is also important for us to be familiar with the UN Resolution 2334 in 2011, and also it was revised in 2016, I want to say. All right, don't quote me on that date. I might be slightly off here now that I think about it. But I won't spend time going on this. But if you're looking along on the slides for yourself, notice that you can click and it will pull the UN resolution right up if you want to analyze that document. That would be a really good idea. What if it's quoted or something in a multiple choice question? You might want to be familiar with the language. But nonetheless, it's important for us to realize that a new prime minister takes, the prime minister, rather, was assassinated, Yitzhak Rabin. And when he was assassinated, this very quickly leads to ultimately a decline in the attempts to establish peace regarding these settlements. But we did not include Rabin in one of our quiz terms, so I would not get too anxious about that. Okay, so what is anti-Semitism? I think we generally understand the idea, but we may not be as familiar with the context. And with that said, by no means is anti-Semitism a 19th and 20th century phenomenon. Anti-Semitism existed all the way back to the times of ancient Egypt, for example. There is historical, in addition to biblical, proof that there were Jews in places like Elephantine, Egypt, that did experience a pretty significant amount of persecution because they were religious outsiders. Some argue, but it is disputed, that the ancient Israelites were slaves who built the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. But nonetheless, we do know that this is not exclusively a modern phenomenon. But why was it increasing in the 19th century? Well, if you remember from class, this takes place within the context of the age of nationalism. So nationalism, we know what it is in a bigger picture, but how do we define it as an age? Well, there was a period of time in the mid to late 19th century and also the early 20th century where a number of different cultural groups and sometimes just random parts of land were increasingly defining themselves by their nation status rather than something else. So, for example, let's say you were Czech culturally. If you lived in Czechoslovakia, which was a country that was carved out after World War I, you would be seen more as Czechoslovakian in your identity than Czech, at least in theory. So nationalism is obviously more complex than that, but realize that the age of anti-Semitism and also the age of Zionism, for that matter, is contextualized within this broad time period. Another example we could consider is that there were two major European countries, Italy and Germany, that were unified as nations in the years leading up to World War I. Again, why anti-Semitism? Why are Jewish people targeted for persecution? Well, one reason is that they do not have a majority population anywhere. They live in what are called diasporic or spread out communities, right? Or a diaspora. So because of that, they oftentimes experience essentially the fear of the unknown, right? And this next slide will give you a better sense of what I mean here. Again, this is highlighting fears, not realities. So in particular in Europe, as there's an increase in industrialization and urbanization, and more people are living in close quarters, and more people are competing for jobs, you see a general fear that the other, not exclusively Jews, but a person, an immigrant, for example, was going to displace the worker from their job. Okay? And this was something that was perceived as a threat. The other fear among many Christian Europeans was that Jews were overrepresenting their population in certain professions. And what we mean by overrepresentation is that there would be more people in the percentage-wise in a certain field than there would be in the general population. All right. So let me just give a parallel example, right? The United States, the population of African Americans is about 12.3%, I want to say, as of 2018. And yet in the Senate, they make up, they make up, I think, 3% of the Senate. Yes, there are 3 black senators, and they make up 9% of the House of Representatives. So that's an example of underrepresentation of the black population. The fear here was that Jews were overrepresenting certain job fields. All right. This link again is active if you wanted to read a very anti-Semitic, unfortunately, but a piece that is essentially articulating what this fear is. And this is going to result in, of course, discrimination and prejudice, like we already said, and also pogroms, which were essentially instances of terror, often that lasted only a night. Zionism. Big picture, it is the desire to have a Jewish state, or also Jewish nationalism. Two major figures that we should just be familiar with. Neither of them are terms, but it's nice to know the names. Are Leo Pinker, who wrote Auto-Emancipation, and you can see his arguments below, and also Theodor Herzl, probably the better known of the two, who wrote The Jewish State. And when he first, as you can see, when he first writes The Jewish State, he does not say anything about the region for where Palestine is. But you do see in the map that we talked about previously that later that year that there is a more specific desired location articulated by Herzl for where Israel should be. All right. So I actually just want to zero in on two terms in this slide. We talked about the Balfour Declaration already, so just remember what that was and now introduce the white paper. All right. So the white paper, 1939, the year matters. 1939 was the first year of World War II. And the white paper was a British promise now to guarantee some sort of Palestinian statehood. Now, we can only surmise why that's problematic. That the Jewish population, especially the people who had been settling in Israel, or not yet Israel rather, but Palestine, were furious. They felt betrayed. They thought that the white paper essentially canceled out the Balfour Declaration. So just realize that these two documents in some ways work against one another, and it further adds complexity to this just general question of what and who led to this dire situation in Israel-Palestine. All right, so why does Jerusalem matter so much? We've talked about this a lot, but Jerusalem is a very holy city, actually, for all three of the world's largest monotheistic religions. For the Jewish people, most specifically, the Wailing Wall is the religious relic, and for the Muslims, it is the Temple of the Rock, right? And you can see why they're significant. Of course, Christians also find value, in particular, in the Wailing Wall because of the Judaic roots of the First Testament, or the Old Testament rather. All right, we talked about the partition in the previous video, but just to really sum it up with a little bit more detail, and you can see all this right in front of you, just notice first of all that when the partition is drawn in 1947, that despite the fact that there is much more of a majority population of Arabs in the region, that the majority of land goes to the Jews. And you might question why that is. The reason why was because the United Nations was anticipating a further increase in Jewish migration to the region. And again, remember that this partition was drawn up in 1947, when there was a major need to find a home for all of the people who had survived the Holocaust and all of the other people, the Jewish people who did not have a safe place to live in the wake of World War II. Jerusalem, as we already said, was to remain an international city. And the last really important part of this partition plan is that the Arabs rejected it, not surprising, but the reason why, in addition to rejecting it just because they may have felt like they did not get a fair deal, they also rejected it because there were no Arabs on the committee that negotiated the partition. So they felt deliberately slighted in this negotiation. I would recommend that you guys watch this video on your own. This is slide 16. These two. All right, cool. So immediately after, actually not immediately after the partition, there already was a lot of conflict, but out and out civil war erupts after that, right? We could call it guerrilla conflict, but ultimately you're going to see a rapid escalation of violence after the partition, and much more so when the British decide to evacuate the mandate. Their military, that is, decides to evacuate the mandate. All right, so May 14th is Israeli Independence Day, May 14th, 1948, and the day after that is when the War for Independence, or also the Arab-Israeli War, the first Arab-Israeli War, starts, right? Now, 6 different nations, Arab nations, immediately attack Israel as a result of their Declaration of Independence on the previous day, today. You can see those nations here, right? It's important for us to realize that an immediate refugee crisis of both Jews and Arabs resulted from this war. Also, note the change in territories, right? Note that the Gaza portion of land was reduced to the small strip that we see. It largely still is today. It's actually even smaller now. And again, this region of land is smaller than New York City, and also you see that these regions of northern Palestine are also now ceded to Israel as a result of the war. And the other really significant part of this war that we should take away is the UN partition was non-binding, right? A UN resolution of this nature was not necessarily something that could be enforced, but a military victory was much more of a solid claim of land from the Israeli perspective. All right? And then the last thing I want to indicate, if you haven't read it already, is the location of Jerusalem. Note how much further in the Israeli territory goes now. So this effectively splits Jerusalem in half into West Jerusalem, which was largely a Jewish portion of the city, at least on a de facto basis, and then also you have East Jerusalem, which was the desired capital for a future state of Palestine. All right, this slide I think kind of speaks for itself. I would just have you guys pause here and just think about why this matters, right? Think about what the Palestinians might say, for example, hence the quotes. And again, we talked about this a little bit just now, the sort of ways in which the Israeli government and people felt that they had a mandate now to continue their settlements in the region. All right, so I want to cut off again here and pick up at the green line. I'm going to tell you right now it's Friday night, and I am going to stop for the night with these videos, but I will pick up with more reviews tomorrow. Note that these are in a lot of detail, so I hope that they really help you, and they certainly do take time, so please take the time to watch these if they help you study. All right, thanks so much, and we'll pick back up tomorrow. So long.